legislation can be supportive, from the feedback that we're receiving from ELSP supported projects, we recognise that it can also present barriers. So we've invited Elsie, Blackshaw, Crosby and Catarina Prata from the Lifescape Project to give a presentation on the work they're doing in collaboration with Rewilding Europe and Rewilding Britain, which is helping rewilding projects to understand how the law applies to their project interventions. Just a brief bit of background to Elsie and Catarina. Elsie is a lawyer and she leads the Lifescape legal team, where she specialises in understanding and applying the law as it relates to rewilding activities, including animal reintroductions. And much of her work is focused on identifying where current legal frameworks across the UK and Europe may pose a barrier to rewilding, but she's also kind of working to identify potential solutions and ways to remove those barriers to allow rewilding to become a reality. Catarina is a Fulbright scholar and a legal expert with a PhD in international law, and she's managing the Rewilding Law Hub project for Europe, and she's kind of working with initiatives to develop solutions for overcoming the various legal barriers which may be hampering kind of rewilding efforts. So I'm going to hand over to Catarina, who's going to give an overview of the work that the Lifescape Project are doing. And then we've asked Marta Calix from the Greater Coa Valley project in Portugal just to share a few words about their experience of working with the Lifescape project. Good, over to Catarina. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. So I'll be sharing this presentation with Elsie, and she's going to introduce the Lifescape project, and I will provide more detail on the European side. But let me just share our presentation with you.
Thank you to ELSP for inviting us to speak this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name's, as Sarah said, my name's Elsie Blackshaw Crosby, and I'm the managing lawyer at the Lifescape Project. The Lifescape Project is a multidisciplinary UK rewilding project or charity, and we're here to tell you today about our rewilding law work, which we're doing across the UK and various jurisdictions in Europe, and which focuses on crystallising and sharing knowledge about the law as it applies to rewilding or restoration activities. And Catarina's with us, who focuses on our rewilding law work in Europe. And what we plan to do today is to give you a brief introduction to Lifescape and then show you our Rewilding Law Hub, which is on our website, and explain what type of information you'll be able to find there, before going into greater detail about the current phase of our work, which is looking at the systemic legal and regulatory barriers to rewilding and attempting to overcome those in relation to specific projects. So a quick introduction to Lifescape and who we are. As I said, we're a UK charity. We were originally formed in 2017 and we became a registered charity in 2020. Our vision is to create a world that's rich in wild landscapes, and we believe that rewilding is one method of achieving this. One of our USPs is our multidisciplinary approach to our work. So within our team, we have expertise in science, technology, law, economics, and culture. And we bring these disciplines into all of our work to the extent possible. So in addition to our rewilding law work, some of our current notable projects include projects looking at the possibility of reintroducing the lynx to England and Scotland. For those of you in the UK, you may have seen our launch of the Missing Lynx project in Northumberland in recent weeks. And we also do quite a lot of work considering the economic and natural capital aspects of rewilding. I'll pass over to Catarina now, who's going to tell you more specifically about our rewilding law work.
Okay, thank you, Elsie. So as Elsie presented, one of our projects in the legal team is rewilding law. And our first major project was to launch the first ever resource center on legal aspects of rewilding. So to give you a snapshot of what it is a center where you can find diverse information on different aspects of rewilding, just going to acquiring and securing land for rewilding, to permits, how to work with rewilding in protected areas, liabilities for damage caused by animals, or if you have a rewilding project that is open to the public, what is your liability towards the public? Also, what are the general steps to remove dams, what are grazing rights, and how to acquire grazing rights. So it has a diverse myriad of topics as well as jurisdictions. So currently we have nodes on Italy, Poland, Portugal, England and Wales, and Scotland, and we will add Germany and Romania soon. Also, and one new aspect of this project is that in England and Wales and Scotland, we are preparing nodes looking at permission to rewild fresh water, and also another node on the use of large herbivores in rewilding and the associated regulatory regimes as well. So this is what we've been doing. So let me just take you on a visit to our website. This is the main page where you can have a summary, and then you have the jurisdictions that we have. And let me just, because we are focusing also in Portugal today, let me just open the notes on the part of Portugal. You have the main topics we are addressing, and then the notes, and you can view them both in English and Portuguese or download them. So this is the topics that we are addressing. Let me just show you how a note looks like. So you can see, we try to make those as accessible as possible with clear language. So on the first page, you have like a snapshot of what we are going to talk about and what topics we are addressing. And then we dive into the topics, and we use also, let me see, we use also practical examples to illustrate some of the matters we are addressing. So this might help you when looking for the information. So when we were doing this in partnership with Rewilding Europe and Rewilding Britain, we identified that there were some topics that that we could see in all jurisdictions, and they were pressing to the practitioners. So we identified where the law is currently working as a barrier to those issues. And so the next step was to think about how to turn the law from being a barrier to being an opportunity. So these 4 points were kind of the key systemic issues that we've identified. So protecting rewilding land for the long term, the legal conditions for natural grazing of large herbivores, the legal framework for reintroductions, which suffers from huge inconsistencies. It's really complex and sometimes chaotic to navigate through the network and actually understand what is needed to implement a reintroduction program. And also, when the law was created, even the most recent one, it had not the rewilding mindset. So it is sometimes difficult to think about the existing legal rules in a rewilding context. So that's also a part of the next steps and how to bring rewilding to the legal discourse and to the legal initiatives. So because we are limited in time and resources, from these 4 points, we are moving on to a new phase where we are going to try new legal solutions and to overcome those barriers. And at the moment, we are focusing both in Europe and the UK. We are focusing in two key issues, which are securing long-term protection of land for rewilding and securing natural grazing conditions. So what we are looking for is concrete examples of rewilding projects that are facing these barriers. And we are working with the practitioners in these cases to look for new ways of overcoming those barriers and putting legal solutions working for rewilding instead of against rewilding. So we are doing that, and we want to document and share the learnings, because we believe that although it's concrete cases we are talking about, the learnings and the principles that are behind it can be replicated in other cases in the same country or even in other countries. So we are going to test this. We are firm believers in showing by doing. So that's what we are trying to accomplish here, and the final result will be documented and shared with everyone that has an interest in these matters. And with all this dynamic of identifying barriers after searching what the law currently says, and how it may work for rewilding, we also found niches of new legal opportunities, of new laws that can come to life with a rewilding mindset. And a good example of that is the nature restoration law, which at the moment is in a standstill. We are not sure if it's going to pass or not, but regardless of the final outcome of the nature restoration law, we can already see an accomplishment that it brought to rewilding law. So I think one of the main achievements of this law, as it currently stands, is the principle of the obligation of continuous improvement and non-deterioration. And what the law did was to take some of the rewilding principles and make it a legal obligation. So it gave a legal code to it, and so practitioners can use it to enforce some of the aspects of their rewilding project. This could be easier if the nature restoration law comes to effect, but if it's not, we can also take this legal principle that has been created and apply to it in some of our work. So that's one example of the work that we can do in the future with all this knowledge that we've gathered. So in practice, what we are doing. So you saw the jurisdictions that we are covering, and one of those is Portugal. We are working with Rewilding Portugal there, and one of the key issues is how to secure land for the longest term possible, because rewilding and restoration needs time. So it's important to make sure that the benefits of rewilding in a land stay protected for the longest term possible, ideally in perpetuity. So what we are doing is testing legal solutions that make the long-term restoration of land possible, to guarantee the impact of rewilding to stay to perdure in time. We are looking at different legal solutions, because in Europe there's no conservation easements in the sense of the US, for instance. So we are looking at the existing legal mechanisms and see which can be applied to make this objective happen. So we are thinking how to hold the land for rewilding, and how can property law can be applied to rewilding. So now we are working on some property rights that exist in many countries that we are working, and can be used and test them. So these, although these rights have been encoded in civil law, they have never been tested for rewilding. So that's what we are doing in the Greater Coa Valley with Rewilding Portugal as our partners on the site. And what we want is to secure land, and what this means, and probably some of you are facing this, as the poll showed, are facing this exact problem in the countries that you are based, is that securing land means to have legal guarantees that the area of land stays dedicated to rewilding purposes, regardless of who owns that land. So basically, the rewilding purpose runs with the land and not with the owner. So that's the ultimate goal, and if possible, in perpetuity. So that would be the ideal, even if perpetuity is not possible for the longest term. And those legal mechanisms exist. And so we need to kind of start thinking outside of the box and use these mechanisms to apply them in a rewilding setting. And that's one of the pilots that we are doing in Portugal, as also to show that sometimes you don't need to reinvent the wheel. The wheel is already there. You just need to use it in a creative way. So that's the work that we've been doing in Portugal and other countries, as well as in the UK, as Elsie is going to present next.
Thanks, Catarina. Yeah, in the UK context, we're quite lucky in that there are actually, dedicated legal mechanisms that permit the long-term protection of land. In Scotland, there is a mechanism called conservation burdens, which have been around for quite a long time, but haven't, as far as we know, been used for sort of securing land or protecting land in the long term for nature restoration purposes. They've been used typically to conserve, say, cultural heritage, so protecting buildings from being used in different ways, or land that's got particularly sort of cultural significance, ensuring that it doesn't change its land use. But we think there's real opportunity to use them for the protection of nature and land that's been rewilded or restored. And so with this in mind, we registered successfully with the Scottish Government to become a responsible body, and that registration was put into legislation earlier this year. And we are keen to work with projects to put burdens in place for the long-term protection of land that's being restored for nature in Scotland. And then in England, there is a similar, slightly different regime that's much newer. It was brought in under the Environment Act 2021, which is our kind of key bit of legislation post-Brexit, key bit of environmental legislation post-Brexit. And that's only, the regime has only really started to be able to be operated in the past few months, with the first responsible bodies being registered this year. And Lifescape has applied to be a responsible body. We're just waiting to hear from DEFRA as to whether or not that application has been successful. But in the meantime, we're already working with landowners who are rewilding their land and want to use conservation covenants to protect those efforts, but also specifically in order to sort of as part of their efforts in relation to biodiversity net gain, which is a specific, again, new mechanism under the Environment Act, which requires there to be a 10% uplift in biodiversity following any development of land. And we're hoping to put our first conservation and covenant in place in England in this summer. In addition to these public mechanisms, we're sort of also taking a similar approach to the one that Catarina has mentioned in Portugal, of looking at where there are existing legal mechanisms which could be used for the protection of nature. And so for those of you in the UK, you'll be aware that there's a very particular legal structure of freehold and leasehold land ownership and rights to land in the UK. And we think that we can use that existing, legal basis of how land is owned and used to actually protect nature if landowners are willing to do that. And we think that using that mechanism could actually go significantly beyond the burdens and covenants that are provided for in law, and offer better long-term protection than those public law regimes. But we're kind of at early stages of this work, and we're very happy to talk to projects who would be interested in finding out more about our work, or sort of like thinking about how their land may be able to be protected. Yeah, next slide, please, Catarina. And then I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our large herbivore work in the UK as well, because it's taking up a lot of our time, and I think it's another issue that applies across so many jurisdictions. I'll tell you about the UK today, but we are also at the early stages of looking at similar issues in other European jurisdictions as well. So in the UK, many of our native herbivores are no longer present, and some have become extinct. And in the UK, as elsewhere in Europe, there are lots of rewilding projects that are using large herbivores in a sort of a kept manner for the purposes of nature restoration, and they're often being used as proxies for missing species. And in many cases, these animals are treated from a legal and regulatory perspective as the same as, for example, cattle that are kept in an intensive agricultural system for the production of milk. And this is because of how our legal system it distinguishes between domestic and wild animals. In the UK, at least, it's an absolute dichotomy. There's no sort of in-between category, and the animals are either wild or they are domestic. And it means that all animals falling into the regime of domestic animals need to, for example, be ear tagged, and their carcasses need to be disposed of via incineration, even if they're not going into the food chain. And therefore a lot of the thinking and purposes behind those regulations don't necessarily apply to those animals as a matter of fact. And working with a number of projects on the ground, we understand that the kind of really strict nature of this regulation and oversight can limit the ecological impact that those animals could potentially have in the landscape. And for some projects, it becomes virtually impossible to allow the animals to roam as they wish while also complying with their legal obligations. And so in the UK, we're taking a number of approaches using test cases in the similar way that Catarina described to move forward the conversation about how this can change and ideally work towards achieving that change while acknowledging and mitigating the risks in relation to, for example, disease control and concerns around animal welfare. So I'll just talk you through quickly the examples of what we're doing in the UK. So we are part of a multidisciplinary group called the Large Herbivore Working Group, and that has the aim of facilitating the use of large herbivores in nature restoration in the UK. And we are leading on the sort of legal side of that and figuring out how what the legal barriers are, and legal barriers and opportunities. And we have identified 3 specific kind of issues and test cases that we're going to work on over the next couple of years. And in relation to all of them, we're quite at the early stages of of how they will actually be implemented. But we are working with one project specifically in relation to semi-wild ponies. So in the same way that there is in Europe, there's already a derogation from passporting and microchipping for semi-wild ponies, but only in specified herds. So they've been the way the European legislation was implemented in the UK means that rather than there being, for example, a criteria-based system which says that if wild ponies are living in these conditions or in this amount of land or are being used for these purposes, then they can benefit from this derogation. What's happened in the UK is there's in the legislation itself, there's a list of the specific areas that benefit from the derogation. And so we are working with a project to try to go through the process of getting them added to that list. And we will then be able to share our knowledge and experience so that other suitable projects might be able to go through that process as well more easily. And then we're also wanting to look at whether or not we can engage with the government to actually change the legislation so it does become criteria based and could be people could apply if they satisfy their criteria. They could submit an application rather than needing the legislation itself to be amended each time a new project gets added. We're also specifically looking at the use of hardy breeds of cattle as proxies. We've identified where the current regime is unnecessarily restrictive, and it's very sensitive due to possible risks of disease, health and welfare. But we believe that changes could be made which don't add risks in those areas, but also reduce the regulatory burden and achieve maximum ecological impact. So, for example, there's a herd of cattle called the Chillingham cattle up in Northumberland in the north of England, which do have a much reduced regulatory burden and framework applied to them that seems to have developed over the years as a result of conversations with DEFRA. And we would like to, we're sort of spending quite a lot of time on trying to understand that and think about whether that's something that could be replicated more widely. And then finally, we're looking at sort of the use of large enclosures for animals such as bison, and thinking about whether there could be a streamlining of the regulation that's applied there, because at the moment they seem to be regulated under 3 different regimes for livestock, wild animals and privately kept animals, which makes it an enormous burden for the projects and makes them much less likely to go ahead and achieve the ecological impact that they're capable of. And as I said, we're also addressing these very similar issues in Spain, hopefully with projects there as well. Next slide, please, Catarina. So I'll just finish here by saying that as kind of a brief word of advice, and as I'm sure you're all very aware if you're involved in projects on the ground, that our experience is that kind of legal and regulatory frameworks will impact most projects because they ultimately sort of control most things that happen in our societies, because that's how we're set up. And our experience is that if it's possible to understand the legal hurdles at the planning stage of the project, it can be much more efficient because you can take them into account. You can be working to sort of resolve them and think about them in parallel with some of the more sort of preparatory actions that you might be doing on the ground, rather than coming up against them towards the end of the project and then it causing significant delay while you figure out how to deal with them. And if it's of interest, Lifescape may be able to assist projects in thinking about the issues that they're likely to come up against, subject to there being funding to do that. And I mean, I would also just say we're not able to give sort of formal legal advice, but we do have a lot of experience around the general issues and also the sort of the solutions that you may want to think about, in terms of how other projects have overcome similar hurdles. So please do get in touch. Our our contact details at the end of the slides, which we'll be happy to share with you after the call today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Elsie and Catarina. Really, really helpful presentation. And yeah, I've taken down quite a few notes. But I think one of your very important messages there is that, you need to be thinking about the legal and regulatory framework that you're kind of operating in, at the very early stages, at the planning stages of an initiative. Okay, Marta, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about some of the issues that you've faced in the Greater Coa Valley and how the Lifescape project is kind of helping you to address those.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Catarina and Elsie, for the presentation. Yeah, so Rewilding Portugal has been one of the rewilding landscapes that has been working with the Lifescape project. And in the first stage of that collaboration, all of those notes were developed on the different topics. All of these are very relevant for our work. So we have natural grazers. We are looking into land protection, species reintroductions. And in Portugal, you have quite a challenging environment, let's say, because things are not really properly set up at the government level. The agency in charge of nature conservation in Portugal is highly incompetent. And so basically we get blocked of doing a lot of things that we could be doing in terms of rewilding and nature conservation because we go up against all of these regulatory and legal hurdles. So I think I'll touch on the land protection one because also Catarina spoke a little bit about that one, and it's one of the most important ones for us at the moment because what happens in Portugal is that between 95 and 99% of the land is privately owned. There are basically no public lands in Portugal. So even all protected areas, including our only national park, it's all privately owned. So this has always created a lot of issues for doing nature conservation, even in protected areas in Portugal. And they end up being a bit like paper parks. So if you want to protect land for nature, what Rewilding Portugal has been trying to do, or one of the approaches, is to either own land, so we buy it, we own properties, and we also have management agreements with landowners in the region to manage their properties and do sort of like long-term management agreements to use that land or dedicate that land for rewilding and conservation. But obviously Rewilding Portugal is an NGO, it's an association, and if we disappear, what happens to the land? So that's kind of the starting point for figuring out what legal mechanisms can be used to ensure that regardless of what happens to Rewilding Portugal, all of this land that is already being used for rewilding now can stay protected in the future. And so that was one of the most interesting areas for us to work with the Lifescape project. And it was really cool because we did a workshop also with other Portuguese NGOs, and we were discussing and brainstorming all of these issues, trying to figure out whether through existing legal mechanisms or through other new developed things, what would be the best way to protect the land. And at least for Rewilding Portugal at the moment, what it looks like will be the path for us is that we might need to set up a foundation, like a separate entity from Rewilding Portugal, just a foundation to hold the land. And foundations are slightly more secure than NGOs. If you set up the governance in a way that really ensures that the foundation can run and hold the land for a longer period of time, we're talking 50, 100 years into the future, then that's already a lot safer than an NGO that depends on grants and sometimes doesn't know what's going to happen 5 years from now to support its work and to hold the land. So that's where we are at the moment. And I'm also happy to answer any questions about our legal challenges in Portugal. Cheers.
That's excellent, Marta. And, as you say, kind of looking at mechanisms where kind of the land isn't, the conservation covenant goes with the land and not kind of with the individual or the organization who owns that land. So really interesting.